Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Inside Injuries podcast for NFL Week 9. As always, I'm here. I'm your host, Tim McCullough, and with me today is Virginia Zakis from Inside Injuries. Virginia, how are you doing this afternoon?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. We still have quite a number of injuries. We've also got some players coming back from injuries this week, some interesting players, and some of these guys were written about in some of our articles this week. We also have plenty of questions from some of our readers, so we've got quite a lot to cover today. So let's get going right away, and we'll start with Tyreek Hill. Is there still a reason to be concerned after he practiced on Wednesday?
So it's definitely good news to see him get in a full practice to start the week. He left Sunday's game with a groin injury. Thankfully, this sounds relatively minor, but we still do have him at an elevated injury risk. Sounds like he should be good to go this weekend as long as he doesn't have a setback. But groin strains and these, slight muscular injuries can just be so tricky. Even when you think you're totally fine, it just takes one slight little wrong movement to aggravate it. So he should be good to go this weekend, but he's still someone to watch. It definitely wouldn't take much for him to make the injury a little bit worse at some point
Yeah,
in a few weeks.
I have to agree with you there. Thing is, if Hill does play, if Hill is going to play, he is a must-start player. The reason being, the Cleveland Browns are a team in total disarray after the changes at coach and at offensive coordinator. As a defense, they've still been, as good as the defense has been, really, they've still been one of the worst in the NFL against the wide receiver position. They've allowed just shy of 1,500 yards this season. I think it's 1493 or something crazy like that, and 9 touchdowns to wide receivers, a total of an average of 40.7 fantasy points per game. I mean, right away that makes Hill a must-start player against them. And I think as long as you watch the injury reports in the coming days and check in with Inside Injuries prior to the game, he should be able to start for you. All right, moving on. Cooper Kupp. A lot of questions about him. And I have some myself since I own Kupp in several different leagues. The big one is he ready to come back? Is he fully back from his injury?
So when he originally suffered that MCL sprain, we gave him a grade 2 injury, which means a moderate sprain, and that comes with a 4-week optimal recovery time. So he's still 1 week shy of that. Now his numbers have been improving. He's no longer a high injury risk. He's now elevated, and his health performance factor, which is our metric to predict performance, is at below average. It's getting much closer to that above average category. So, I think in this situation, he's one of those guys where if you need to start him, sure, you play him, but know that there's still some risk, and he could need, I'd say, 1 to 2 weeks, and then he should be good to go and back in his pre-injury form.
All right. I've gotten a lot of questions about whether or not I should start him this week or whether I would start him this week. And what happens if he does start? What's going to happen to some of the other Rams receivers? So let's just take a quick look at that. Kupp is a slot receiver, and the Saints are a bottom 10 team against the slot. They allow a 72.7% completion rate and an average of 8 completions per game to slot receivers. On top of that, they're the third worst red zone defense this season. They allow a score 74% of the time when a team gets into the red zone. I mean, that right away tells me that Kupp is got the potential for a great game if he's fully healthy. As far as the other Rams receivers go, Cooks is going to get his because the Saints allow the highest completion rate in the NFL at 59.3%, and the second most fantasy points per attempt to deep wideouts. So Cooks is definitely going to get his today in the game. I'm sorry, whether Kupp plays or not. Uh, and the same goes for Robert Woods. I mean, the Saints have allowed a total of an average of 235.7 yards and 52.3 fantasy points per game. That's the most in the NFL to opposing wideouts. That means Robert Woods is going to get his too. So what it comes down to is this. I'd start all three of them. There's no question about it. If Kupp is going to play this week, you got to have him in there. The matchup is just way too juicy The Saints are the worst team in the NFL against wide receivers. You got to go for it. Let's move on and talk about the Texans receivers. First of all, let me ask you, Virginia, is Kiki Coty going to return this week?
It sounds like he's at this point truly questionable. He returned to a limited practice on Wednesday after missing week 8. This is yet another example of how difficult it is to recover from hamstring strains. His problems started, he had issues in college, and his hamstring problems this season started during the preseason. He didn't make his debut until week 4, kind of played through the injury until he really re-aggravated it in week 7. So taking 2 weeks off does concern me in this situation because of his history. I think he's going to be a very risky player the rest of the season. Obviously, he has a lot of upside, but I think no matter what, at some point he's going to miss more games or he's not going to be able to finish a game. And the question is now, is it going to be in week 9? Does he make it through week 9 and it's a few weeks later that he leaves? But there's a lot of risk here.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of questions. We're still getting a lot of questions about Will Fuller. Of course, he's on injured reserve. What's the long-term outlook for Fuller? And I guess we're talking about next season.
Yeah, obviously he's done for the year after tearing his ACL. He should be ready to come back, and best guess is they kind of work him in slowly during the preseason next year. But barring a setback, he should be good to go week 1. Based on how he hurt his knee, I wouldn't be surprised if there was also some damage to the MCL. Always have to be addressed during surgery unless it's a very serious tear of that ligament. So I don't think it's anything that's going to really lengthen his recovery time too much. Typically around roughly 8 months is enough to get back to pretty close to 100%. So I think he should be good to go by week 1 of next season.
All right. Let me give you some of my thoughts on Kiki Coty and Demaryius Thomas. We've had questions about both players this week. As far as Coty is concerned, this is not a week where I would really look to start him unless you absolutely had to. And I would think that most people do not. He was a waiver wire pickup just a few weeks ago. His production in week 6 and 7, of course, he wasn't fully healthy in these weeks, but his production in those 2 weeks was really poor. He only produced 3.6 fantasy points total in those 2 weeks. That was after 2 weeks of breaking double-digit fantasy points. If he is even partially injured and not really fully healthy, I can't see putting him in there, especially against the Broncos, who can be tough on wide receivers. They've only allowed 35.3 fantasy points to opposing receivers on average per week. And that's to all wide receivers in a game. I hope folks understand that. And they've only allowed 9 TDs to the position too. So I can't see Coty having a very good week if he's in there. As far as Thomas goes, I have mixed feelings about Demaryius Thomas. He's clearly lost a step. There's no question about that in my mind. When you take a look at his numbers with Denver this year, I mean, he's only averaging 7.3 fantasy points per game. That's his lowest per game average going back to 2011, his second season with the team. He's only had 402 yards this season on 36 receptions. His catch rate is as poor as it's ever been, if not worse. I'm just not real thrilled. Having said that, he's now going to be on a team. He's going to be on a team with Hopkins, and he's going to draw most of the attention, double coverage most of the time, which could leave Thomas in single coverage. But let's keep in mind that when he was with Denver, Emmanuel Sanders was drawing the double coverage most of the time, and Thomas still wasn't very productive. So I'm not real big on Thomas this week against Denver either. If you have to play him, obviously you're going to, especially with 6 teams on bye this week. But again, I'm just not real thrilled with either player against Denver this week. All right, we have a lot of injured quarterbacks this week. So if you will, Virginia, let's go through the list one by one and tell us a little bit of your thoughts on each one of them. Let's start with Blake Bortles.
Yeah, so he's dealing with an injury to his left non-throwing shoulder. The team expects him to be okay following the bye week. We don't really know what's going on here. I have a slight suspicion that he's dealing with a more serious injury that could even potentially require surgery, and the team just isn't telling us that. But that's just me reading into some of the quotes I've read. So um, again, it's an injury to his non-throwing shoulder, so he should be okay. But it could affect his, he might be a little more tentative because he doesn't want to take hits. It could affect his ball security if he's ever trying to protect the ball with his left hand. So something to watch, but not too much concern.
All right, let's move on down to Miami now, where we can talk about Ryan Tannehill. He's not going to start again this week, right?
Correct. He's out again this week. The team said it's not a sprain, but they won't say what's actually going on. I still have a suspicion it could be an AC sprain, which is one of the joints in the shoulder. They keep saying he's not going to need surgery for now, but they also haven't said that he's not ever going to need surgery. So again, this is a situation where I think there's a more serious injury, such as maybe a slight tear to the rotator cuff or labrum, that the team, doesn't want to fully admit to, but something that could eventually either get worse or is already pretty bad and will require surgery after the season.
All right. Now let's move up to cold country in Buffalo. Josh Allen. He's been out for several weeks now with an injury to his elbow, and sort of an ill-defined injury. We haven't really heard exactly what it is. Can you tell us a little bit about Josh Allen and his prospects for returning?
Yeah, so he's out again this week. He still isn't throwing the football, and it's been, I believe, 2 or 3 weeks since he injured his elbow. It sounds like a partial tear to the UCL, which is the main ligament in the elbow. It's an injury we hear about a lot in baseball, but it's very, very rare in football when players need Tommy John surgery. At this point, he does not need surgery, but as a quarterback, he does put a good bit of stress on his arm. If there's already a partial tear there, it's something that over time with wear and tear or just, one wrong hit can easily be made worse. I would not be surprised even if he's cleared to throw and return in the next, say, 2 to 4 weeks, he aggravates the injury again and ends up missing more time or is shut down and undergoes surgery, ending his season.
All right, now, Big Ben Roethlisberger. Can you tell us what the story is with his fractured finger?
Yep, so a little more optimism here. He's dealing with a fractured index finger on his left hand. So he played through it in the second half last week, did totally fine. He's going to play this week. Again, he should be okay. Needs to make sure he's not putting himself in situations where he's scrambling or rushing and has the ball in his left hand, but that's not something he would do often anyways. So not too much concern here.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about starting him this week either. It's not a great matchup against the Ravens, but he fared pretty well against the Ravens when they hosted him in Pittsburgh earlier this season. We was able to put up 17.6 fantasy points in that game after throwing for 274 yards and a touchdown with 1 interception. So I still like Big Ben this week, and I would go ahead and start him if you need to, especially again since we have 6 teams on bye. Cam Newton, always a concern, especially when he takes off with the ball, and he's been doing quite a bit again this season. What's the story with his injury, and is he going to need surgery again? Is there something serious going on with his shoulder?
At this point, it looks like he's probably just taking more hits than he needs to. And of course, throughout the season, a quarterback puts a lot of just wear and tear on their shoulder, making a lot of passes. Last few weeks, he's missed a little bit of practice time due to his shoulder. He did not throw at practice Wednesday. It doesn't sound like there's any concern at this point that he's going to miss any games. But for someone like Newton, who takes way more hits than most quarterbacks, and someone who's also recently had surgery on that shoulder, I am growing a bit concerned. There was a play, I believe, late in the first half where most of the time would have attempted a Hail Mary pass and he didn't do it. That could be a sign that his shoulder is bothering him a little more than he's let. I'm not overly concerned right now, but it's something to watch. As the season goes on, I think it could start to affect him more and more, take some power off of his passes, might make him more tentative. And, if he has a week where he can't throw at all, that's really going to affect him in the game.
All right. Let's finish up this week's podcast with a quick look at Stefon Diggs. We'd had some questions about whether or not he's injured. Is that the case?
Yeah, he's dealing with an injury to his ribs. It sounds like more of a pain management issue, as is often the case with rib injuries, especially if there's just a single non-displaced fracture or just a bad bruise. Very painful to play through, but it shouldn't really affect his performance if he gets proper pain management to make it through the game. And he did miss practice yesterday, but he said there's no reason to believe at this point that he's not going to be able to suit up on Sunday.
All right. Just to add a little bit to that, I think the story really is that he's just not connecting with Kirk Cousins as well as people had hoped he would. It was hoped that Cousins' deep ball profile would sort of match up nicely with Diggs, but that just hasn't been the case this season, although he has scored 4 touchdowns this season so far in 8 games, which is pretty much on pace with what he's done in years past. The problem really is that the offense in this team in this game, the passing offense with this team really flows through Adam Thielen, and that's really the main issue here. It's not really anything about Diggs himself. It's just Thielen is the guy, and that's who Cousins has been connecting with. So if you own Stephon Diggs and you need to start him, you've got to put him in there, especially when good matchups come along. He is averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game this season, and he put up 17.9 last week against New Orleans, and earlier this season, 24.9 fantasy points against Green Bay. So it's clear that in certain matchups he can produce well, and I think it really depends on whether or not he's up against elite corners, and whether Thielen's got an elite corner or is being double teamed. That's the story with Diggs. All right, folks. If you've got questions, we urge you to contact us at Inside Injuries on Twitter. You can also send your questions to me at Tim's Tens, TimsTenz on Twitter. And Virginia, why don't you give us your Twitter handle as well?
At the Zakas, Zakas.
All right. This has been the Inside Injuries podcast for week 9 of the NFL season. We urge you to check us out at insideinjuries.com, where you can get the inside edge on injuries in the NFL, the NBA, other leagues throughout the year. Be sure to check us out before game time on Sunday and make sure that your players are playing. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.